She tried to make me disappear in front of 200 guests and a string quartet. That was the thought that passed quietly through Margaret Whitmore's mind the moment she saw her daughter-in-law tilt a tiny glass vial over her champagne. The ballroom of the Fairmont Grand glittered under crystal chandeliers, gold light catching the rims of polished glasses and the silver in Margaret's neatly styled hair. 70 years old, and that evening she had just sold the software logistics company she built from a spare bedroom into a national firm for $23 million. The banners near the stage read "Congratulations, Margaret," and her son Daniel stood proudly beside his wife Lauren, greeting investors, former employees, and old friends who had flown in from Chicago, Dallas, and San Francisco. Margaret accepted handshakes with the same composed smile she had worn in boardrooms for 4 decades, her navy silk gown understated, her posture straight, her eyes attentive. She noticed everything. She noticed how Lauren laughed a little too brightly when guests praised the sale. She noticed Daniel checking his phone more often than usual. And then she noticed the vial. It was small, no bigger than a lipstick sample, clear glass catching the chandelier light for half a second before Lauren's manicured hand shielded it. The liquid inside looked like water. Lauren leaned slightly over the cocktail table where Margaret's champagne rested, her body angled as though adjusting a napkin. A subtle movement. A gentle tilt. A brief swirl of the glass. If Margaret had not built a company by reading rooms and studying expressions, she might have missed it. She did not react. She did not gasp. She did not accuse. She simply reached for her glass, paused, and instead lifted another flute sitting inches away. Moments later, as servers passed trays of hors d'oeuvres and the quartet transitioned into a soft rendition of "What a Wonderful World," Margaret stepped toward Evelyn Parker, Lauren's mother, who was animatedly describing a recent trip to Scottsdale. With a warm, effortless gesture, Margaret handed Evelyn the untouched champagne and accepted the one Evelyn held in return. "To new beginnings," Margaret said evenly, lifting the swapped glass. The toast rippled across the room. Crystal met crystal. 10 minutes later, Evelyn's laughter faltered. Her words slurred into fragments. She blinked slowly, gripping the edge of the table as though the floor had shifted beneath her. Guests murmured that perhaps the excitement had been too much, that perhaps she had not eaten enough. Daniel's face drained of color. Lauren's smile froze. Margaret watched with the same calm she once reserved for quarterly earnings reports that didn't add up. Paramedics were called. The music stopped. Whispers traveled faster than the stretcher rolling across marble floors. Margaret did not follow the ambulance. She remained at the center of the room, hands lightly clasped, accepting concerned looks and murmured sympathies. She knew 2 things with certainty. First, whatever had been poured into that glass was never meant for Evelyn. And second, someone had believed that turning 70 made her easier to erase. They were wrong. The ballroom emptied slowly after the ambulance doors closed and the red lights faded beyond the hotel entrance, and Margaret Whitmore stood near the tall windows overlooking Michigan Avenue, watching her reflection instead of the street below. She saw a composed 70-year-old woman in a navy silk gown, pearl earrings steady against her neck, no tremor in her hands, no crack in her posture, only a stillness that had taken decades to cultivate. Daniel approached her first. His tie loosened, his voice pitched low as if he were discussing a minor inconvenience instead of his mother-in-law being rushed to the hospital. He said that it was probably dehydration, that Evelyn had always been sensitive to champagne, that everything had gotten out of proportion, and Margaret listened without interrupting, noticing how he did not quite meet her eyes. Lauren joined them seconds later, mascara intact, expression carefully arranged into concern, saying she felt terrible, saying she should have insisted her mother eat more, saying perhaps the stress of travel had been too much. Margaret nodded gently and placed a reassuring hand on Lauren's forearm, the gesture almost maternal, almost kind, and she said that health can be unpredictable at any age, that sometimes the body reacts in ways no one expects, and she watched a flicker of uncertainty pass between the couple as if they were recalculating something invisible. When most of the guests had left, Margaret thanked the hotel manager for handling the disruption with discretion and asked that the remaining food be donated to a local shelter as planned. She spoke clearly, steadily, the way she had always spoken when closing negotiations worth millions of dollars. Later that night, back in her lakefront condominium overlooking Lake Michigan. She removed her earrings and set them on the marble dresser beside framed photographs of Daniel as a boy, Daniel at his college graduation, Daniel at his wedding, and she allowed herself one slow exhale. She replayed the moment at the table frame by frame. The vial, the tilt of Lauren's wrist, the careful glance around the room, the swirl of liquid dissolving into bubbles. She did not need confirmation to understand intention, but confirmation would come. At 8:40 the next morning, her personal attorney Thomas Hale called from the hospital after speaking privately with a physician he trusted, and his voice was measured yet unmistakably firm when he said that toxicology had identified a concentrated sedative in Evelyn's system, a dosage far beyond what could be explained by accidental contamination or routine medication interaction. He said the doctors believed the substance had been mixed into a beverage shortly before ingestion, and he paused long enough for the meaning to settle. Margaret thanked him and asked whether Evelyn was stable, and when he confirmed that she was expected to recover fully, Margaret closed her eyes briefly in relief, not because the plan had failed, but because no lasting harm had been done. She ended the call and walked to the window, sunlight spreading across the water in quiet bands of silver, and she thought about the questions Daniel had been asking over the past 6 months about estate restructuring, about simplifying asset management, about how exhausting it must be to oversee trusts and foundations at her age. She thought about Lauren's repeated suggestions that a luxury retirement community in Naples might offer more comfort and less responsibility. She thought about the draft document left casually on her kitchen counter 2 weeks earlier outlining broad power of attorney provisions, and signed, waiting. Margaret had built her company from a $2,000 line of credit and relentless discipline. She had survived recessions, lawsuits, and competitors twice her size. She understood risk assessment better than anyone her son had ever known. Standing there in the morning light, she realized with absolute clarity that someone had attempted to create a narrative in which she appeared unstable, confused, incapable of managing her own affairs, and that narrative would have justified transferring control of $23 million with sympathetic efficiency. Instead, the wrong glass had been lifted. Margaret picked up her phone and scheduled 3 meetings for the afternoon, one with Thomas Hale in person, one with a forensic accountant, and one with a private investigator whose name she had been given years earlier by a board member who believed in preparation over panic. She did not raise her voice, she did not accuse, and she did not confront Daniel or Lauren. She simply began adjusting the architecture of her life the way she once adjusted corporate strategy, quietly, methodically, and without announcing her next move. Margaret Whitmore arrived at Thomas Hale's office at 1:15 in the afternoon, precisely on time, carrying nothing but a leather folder and the calm expression that had unsettled competitors for decades. The office overlooked the Chicago River, sunlight bouncing off glass towers while traffic hummed 20 stories below. And Thomas rose from behind his desk with the same restrained respect he had shown her since he first reviewed her corporate contracts 15 years earlier. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He laid out the preliminary medical findings in clear language, explaining that the sedative identified in Evelyn Parker's system was prescription grade, not available over the counter, and that the concentration indicated intentional administration rather than accidental cross-contact. He emphasized that hospital staff had documented the timing carefully, aligning ingestion with the early portion of the celebration. Margaret listened without visible reaction, hands folded neatly in her lap, then asked a single question about chain of custody for the toxicology report, and Thomas assured her that documentation had already been secured. When the meeting shifted from medical facts to financial exposure, the air in the room seemed to sharpen. Thomas opened a folder revealing data compiled that morning by a forensic accountant, numbers printed in orderly columns that told a quieter but equally troubling story. Daniel and Lauren Whitmore, it appeared, were carrying nearly $5 million in personal and business debt across multiple lines of credit, including a luxury condominium development in Scottsdale that had stalled after cost overruns, 2 refinanced mortgages, and substantial credit card balances tied to travel and consulting ventures that had yet to generate revenue. Interest payments alone were significant, and liquidity was thin. Margaret studied the figures without commentary, recognizing the pattern of overextension disguised as ambition. Thomas then disclosed another detail. 6 months earlier, Daniel had purchased a $10 million life insurance policy listing himself as primary beneficiary and citing estate planning efficiency as the rationale. While such policies were not uncommon among affluent families, the timing intersected uncomfortably with recent discussions about transferring control of assets. Margaret remembered the draft power of attorney left casually on her kitchen island, the language broad enough to grant Daniel sweeping authority in the event she were deemed mentally incapacitated. She remembered Lauren's gentle insistence that managing complex trusts at 70 might be exhausting, that a supportive residential community could simplify everything. The pieces aligned without noise. She instructed Thomas to initiate immediate restructuring of her estate into multiple irrevocable trusts with independent co-trustees and mandatory medical evaluations from 2 unrelated physicians before any determination of incapacity could trigger governance changes. She requested enhanced monitoring clauses and explicit safeguards requiring court oversight for asset liquidation above a defined threshold. Thomas nodded, already drafting revisions in his mind. Before leaving, Margaret authorized the retention of a licensed private investigator to conduct discreet background inquiries into recent financial transactions, insurance communications, and digital correspondence that might reveal coordination or intent. She did not speak Daniel's name with anger, only with clarity. When she stepped back into the afternoon light, the city felt unchanged, traffic steady, pedestrians crossing at the signal, boats gliding along the river. Yet something fundamental had shifted. She understood that what occurred at the celebration was not an impulsive act, but part of a structured plan designed to reframe her as unstable and accelerate a transfer of authority. Instead of confronting her son or his wife, she drove home along Lakeshore Drive with measured composure, already recalibrating the future the way she once recalibrated corporate forecasts, not to punish, but to protect. The following morning, Margaret Whitmore began her day at 6:30 as she had for most of her adult life, not because she needed to report to an office anymore, but because routine steadied the mind. She brewed her coffee, measured precisely, stood by the wide kitchen windows overlooking Lake Michigan, and watched early joggers move along the shoreline path while the city stretched awake. Nothing in her posture suggested urgency, yet her thoughts moved with deliberate precision. At 9 o'clock, she met with the private investigator Thomas Hale had recommended, a former federal financial crimes analyst named Richard Lawson, whose demeanor was restrained and analytical. He did not ask dramatic questions, and he did not speculate. He requested timelines, access permissions, and authorization to review publicly available financial filings, insurance communications, and digital correspondence metadata. Margaret provided what was necessary and nothing more, emphasizing discretion above all else. She did not want confrontation. She wanted clarity. By midday, Richard had already confirmed that Daniel and Lauren had been in frequent contact with an insurance broker specializing in high-value estate transition strategies, and that internal messages from Daniel's development company revealed escalating pressure from lenders regarding overdue interest payments on the Scottsdale project. Projected losses were increasing monthly, and investor patience was thinning. Margaret absorbed the information without visible disappointment, but as she sat at the long oak table in her dining room later that afternoon, she allowed herself to remember Daniel as a child, small hands gripping a baseball glove too large for him, looking to her for reassurance after striking out at a little league game. She remembered staying up late reviewing contracts while he slept down the hall, believing that building stability would protect him from uncertainty. It was not the debt that unsettled her most. It was the calculation. Richard's preliminary digital analysis indicated that in the weeks preceding the celebration, Lauren had searched online for symptoms of sudden cognitive decline in elderly adults and for the legal thresholds required in Illinois to initiate guardianship proceedings based on diminished capacity. The searches were time-stamped late at night, often within minutes of Daniel's own inquiries about expedited asset transfer procedures. None of this was illegal in isolation, but together it sketched an outline that Margaret could not ignore. 2 days later, Thomas informed her that the revised trust structures had been executed, assets allocated across multiple irrevocable entities with independent oversight and mandatory dual physician evaluations before any declaration of incapacity could be recognized. The life insurance policy remained in place, but its financial relevance to control over her estate had been neutralized. Margaret did not notify Daniel of these changes. Instead, she invited him and Lauren to dinner the following Sunday, preparing roasted salmon, asparagus, and a simple lemon tart as if nothing in their world had shifted. During the meal, Daniel spoke about market volatility and future travel plans. Lauren described potential philanthropic partnerships, and Margaret listened, offering thoughtful responses, observing how carefully they watched her for signs of confusion that never appeared. She asked about their Scottsdale development in a tone of mild curiosity and noted the hesitation before Daniel answered. When the evening ended, she hugged her son gently and told him she was proud of his ambition, and he held her a fraction of a second longer than usual, perhaps measuring something intangible. After they left, Margaret returned to her desk and reviewed the latest memorandum from Richard Lawson, which indicated that additional electronic communications suggested coordination regarding a planned meeting with a geriatric specialist known for providing capacity evaluations upon family request. The appointment had been tentatively scheduled for 3 weeks after the celebration. Margaret closed the folder slowly and looked out at the dark water beyond her windows, understanding now that what had begun as suspicion was solidifying into documented intention, and she resolved that whatever unfolded next would unfold on terms she defined. 3 days after the dinner, Richard Lawson requested a second in-person meeting, and Margaret Whitmore chose a quiet private conference room at a discreet business center near Wacker Drive rather than her condominium. She preferred neutral ground when information carried weight. Richard placed a thin tablet on the table between them and spoke in the same measured tone he had used from the beginning, explaining that recovered message logs between Daniel and Lauren revealed more than financial strain. They revealed sequencing. In one exchange, Lauren wrote that timing would be everything and that once medical documentation reflected confusion or instability, the transition would appear compassionate rather than strategic. Daniel responded that the geriatric evaluation had to follow an incident credible enough to justify concern. Margaret listened without interruption, her hands resting calmly over one another, her expression unchanged, yet something inside her settled into certainty. Richard continued, stating that metadata showed Lauren had researched fast-acting sedatives commonly prescribed for anxiety disorders and sleep conditions and had contacted an acquaintance employed at a boutique pharmacy in a neighboring suburb. While no direct purchase records had been obtained yet, the communication suggested familiarity with dosage strength and onset times. None of this was dramatic when spoken aloud, but together it painted a disciplined attempt to orchestrate perception. Margaret asked one practical question about admissibility, and Richard confirmed that the documented communications, paired with toxicology findings and surveillance footage from the hotel ballroom, would form a coherent evidentiary chain. Later that afternoon, Margaret met Thomas Hale again, this time to review a draft affidavit summarizing the investigative findings. Thomas advised that while immediate legal action was possible, strategic timing would strengthen the case, particularly if Daniel and Lauren proceeded with the scheduled capacity evaluation and paperwork signing they believed was still viable. Margaret agreed. She did not want retaliation. She wanted resolution grounded in proof. That evening, Daniel called to confirm the upcoming appointment with the geriatric specialist, framing it as a precaution to ensure that estate documents remained compliant with current regulations. His voice carried forced warmth, the careful tone of someone rehearsing reassurance. Margaret responded that she appreciated his diligence and that she would attend as scheduled, allowing him to believe the process remained intact. After the call ended, she walked slowly through her living room, pausing before the framed certificate from the day she incorporated her company 38 years earlier. She had built systems to withstand volatility, and she understood that resilience was not loud. The following morning, Thomas finalized the protective trust amendments and coordinated quietly with local authorities, providing them with preliminary evidence under advisement. No public complaint was filed yet, but documentation was preserved. Margaret continued her routine without visible alteration, attending a board meeting for her charitable foundation and reviewing investment allocations with her portfolio manager, each decision reinforcing that her cognitive clarity remained intact. By the end of the week, the outline of what had been intended for her was no longer speculative. It was documented, time-stamped, and archived. Margaret did not feel anger in the way others might expect. she felt something steadier, the recognition that someone had mistaken her age for vulnerability, and that misunderstanding would soon correct itself through the quiet force of facts. The morning of the scheduled evaluation arrived with a quiet clarity that felt almost ceremonial. The sky over Lake Michigan a pale blue streaked with thin clouds, and Margaret Whitmore, dressed with the same understated precision she once reserved for shareholder meetings, choosing a tailored gray suit and low heels that allowed her to move without hesitation. She reviewed a short list of discussion points in her mind, not because she feared the assessment, but because she intended to demonstrate unmistakable lucidity. Daniel arrived at 10 o'clock sharp, his expression attentive yet strained, and Lauren followed a step behind, offering a supportive smile that did not quite reach her eyes. They spoke about traffic and the weather as if this were a routine appointment, and Margaret responded in measured tones, asking Daniel about recent progress on the Scottsdale development, noting the brief pause before he answered that negotiations were ongoing. At the medical office, the receptionist greeted them warmly, unaware of the undercurrent beneath the visit, and Margaret completed her paperwork without assistance, reading each clause carefully before signing. She answered intake questions clearly, listing medications accurately, describing her daily activities, her board responsibilities, and her investment oversight with precise detail. During the cognitive evaluation, she remained composed, recalling sequences of numbers, interpreting proverbs, outlining recent news events with context and analysis. The physician, a man in his late 50s with a calm demeanor, observed her attentively and documented her responses without commentary. Daniel watched from a chair near the wall, hands clasped tightly, while Lauren occasionally glanced at her phone before quickly setting it aside. After 45 minutes, the physician concluded that Margaret exhibited no signs of cognitive impairment and that her executive functioning appeared intact. He stated that any further concerns would require substantive evidence beyond subjective impressions. Margaret thanked him politely and stood, her posture steady. On the drive back, Daniel attempted to frame the appointment as proactive planning, suggesting that clarity now would prevent complications later, and Margaret agreed lightly, remarking that preparation is always wise. That afternoon, Thomas Hale finalized coordination with local authorities, providing them with the medical clearance documentation alongside the toxicology report and digital evidence collected. Timing, he explained, would be crucial if Daniel and Lauren proceeded with the paperwork signing they believed would grant them expanded authority. Margaret spent the evening reviewing financial statements from her foundation, approving grant disbursements to community technology programs and scholarship funds, each signature reinforcing that her decisions remained deliberate and informed. She did not mention the investigator, the trust amendments, or the preserved messages. She simply allowed Daniel and Lauren to continue under the assumption that their narrative remained viable. As night settled over the city, Margaret stood once more by her windows, watching the reflections of streetlights ripple across the dark water, aware that the final act of their plan would likely unfold soon, and when it did, it would meet documentation rather than confusion, oversight rather than surrender, and a woman fully aware of every move. On the board, the appointment to finalize what Daniel described as administrative updates was scheduled for Friday at 11:30 in the private conference suite of Thomas Hale's office, a room Margaret Whitmore knew well, with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the river and a long walnut table polished to a muted sheen. Daniel arrived carrying a leather portfolio, Lauren at his side, both dressed with deliberate professionalism as if this were a strategic merger rather than a family matter. Margaret greeted them warmly, asking whether traffic had been heavy, commenting lightly on the early autumn chills settling over the city, and Daniel responded with careful composure, explaining that the revised documents would ensure efficiency in the event of unforeseen circumstances. He placed the folder on the table and slid it toward her with a gesture that suggested reassurance. Thomas entered moments later, expression neutral, and took his seat at the head of the table while an associate quietly positioned a digital recorder on the credenza. Standard procedure, he said, for significant estate documentation. Margaret opened the folder slowly, scanning the first page as though encountering it for the first time. Even though she already understood that the authority being requested had been structurally rendered ineffective by the amendments completed days earlier, The language still attempted to grant Daniel broad financial discretion contingent upon medical incapacity. But the preconditions embedded in the new trust architecture made that contingency unattainable without independent verification. Lauren leaned forward slightly, suggesting that this step would simply reduce complexity and allow Daniel to manage routine matters should Margaret ever feel overwhelmed, and Margaret nodded, acknowledging the sentiment without committing to the premise. Thomas then cleared his throat and informed them that before proceeding, certain clarifications were necessary. He referenced the recent medical evaluation confirming Margaret's full cognitive capacity and then placed a second folder on the table containing printed copies of electronic communications, insurance policy documentation, and the toxicology report from the hospital. Daniel's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his hand tightening around the edge of the portfolio, while Lauren's gaze flickered toward the door. Thomas spoke evenly, explaining that the sedative identified in Evelyn Parker's system had been matched to a specific formulation commonly dispensed by a boutique pharmacy, and that digital correspondence suggested coordination regarding an incident intended to justify claims of diminished capacity. He did not raise his voice, he did not accuse. He simply stated facts anchored in timestamps and verified records. The room felt smaller as silence settled between sentences. Margaret closed the unsigned document gently and folded her hands atop it, her expression neither triumphant nor wounded, only resolute. She said that misunderstandings within families can be painful, but that clarity protects everyone involved. At that moment, two plainclothes officers entered the suite, their presence calm and procedural, acknowledging Thomas with a nod before addressing Daniel and Lauren regarding an ongoing investigation tied to the earlier medical emergency. There was no spectacle, no raised voices, only formal questions and a request for cooperation. Daniel looked at his mother as if searching for an explanation, but she met his gaze steadily, offering no anger, only recognition. Lauren's composure dissolved into stunned quiet. Margaret remained seated as documentation was reviewed and statements requested, her hands resting lightly on the table, understanding that what had been intended as a transfer of control had instead triggered accountability. When the officers departed with instructions for further inquiry, the conference room returned to stillness, and Margaret stood, smoothing the front of her jacket, aware that the architecture she had built around her life had done exactly what it was designed to do: withstand pressure without collapsing. The days that followed unfolded without raised voices or dramatic scenes, yet the silence carried more weight than any confrontation could have. Daniel retained counsel almost immediately, and Lauren limited her communication to brief, carefully worded messages routed through attorneys, each sentence crafted as though distance alone might undo documentation. Margaret Whitmore did not respond directly to either of them. Instead, she returned to the routines that had defined her for decades, attending foundation board meetings, reviewing quarterly projections for her investment portfolio, and meeting with scholarship recipients whose gratitude was uncomplicated and sincere. News of the investigation remained contained within a narrow legal circle, though whispers inevitably traveled among mutual acquaintances who had attended the celebration. Margaret offered no commentary when asked, only stating that certain matters were being handled appropriately. In private, Thomas Hale updated her on procedural developments, explaining that forensic analysis had confirmed the digital messages were authentic and that pharmacy records, once subpoenaed, aligned with prior communications. The chain of evidence was coherent and persuasive. Margaret listened with the same attentive calm she had displayed in every boardroom crisis, never interrupting, never dramatizing, only absorbing information. She felt neither vindication nor fury, only a quiet recalibration of understanding. She recognized now that ambition without restraint can distort judgment, that fear of financial collapse can tempt even those raised with stability to rationalize dangerous shortcuts. Yet acknowledgement did not soften consequence. As legal proceedings advanced, the request for expanded authority over her estate was formally withdrawn, and the insurance policy that had once seemed strategic now appeared reckless in context. Margaret spent an afternoon reorganizing family photographs, not discarding them, but placing them into a cedar chest in her study, an act neither sentimental nor bitter, simply deliberate. She declined invitations to discuss the matter publicly and avoided speculation about motives, preferring that the facts speak in their own sequence. On a crisp Sunday morning, she attended church alone, sitting near the back as sunlight filtered through stained glass, listening to a sermon about stewardship and accountability. The words did not feel abstract. Later that week, she finalized additional philanthropic commitments, directing funds toward community technology centers in underfunded neighborhoods, ensuring that her resources continued to serve constructive purposes. When Daniel requested a private meeting through counsel, Margaret agreed under structured conditions, choosing a neutral office space rather than her home. The conversation was brief, marked more by pauses than by explanation, and she spoke only to affirm that trust, once fractured, requires time and evidence to rebuild. She did not raise her voice, and she did not revisit the ballroom in detail. The documentation had already done that work. As autumn deepened and the city air cooled, Margaret resumed long walks along the lakefront path, her pace steady, shoulders square, aware that independence is not a declaration but a practice. What had been intended as her quiet removal from control had instead clarified the boundaries of her authority. She had not needed to shout, accuse, or dramatize. She had needed only to remain attentive, to protect what she built, and to let patience reveal intention. In the stillness of early evening, watching the skyline reflect across dark water, Margaret understood that age had not diminished her leverage, it had refined it. Winter settled over Chicago with a quiet authority, the lake turning steel gray beneath low clouds, and Margaret Whitmore found a certain clarity in the colder air. Legal proceedings moved forward in measured increments, never theatrical, always procedural, and by late December formal charges related to attempted financial exploitation and fraudulent inducement had been filed after investigators completed their review of digital correspondence, pharmacy records, and insurance documentation. Daniel and Lauren's attorneys negotiated, argued context, questioned interpretation, yet the timeline remained intact, anchored by medical reports and authenticated messages. The effort to portray Margaret as unstable had collapsed under objective evidence. Margaret attended one preliminary hearing not for spectacle, but for closure. She sat in the gallery with hands folded neatly in her lap, listening as the court outlined obligations and future appearances, her expression composed, neither hardened nor softened by the gravity of the moment. She did not seek public apology, and she did not request dramatic statements. Accountability, once initiated, was sufficient. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited, but Margaret exited through a side corridor arranged by Thomas Hale, preferring discretion over commentary. In the months that followed, Daniel's development project in Scottsdale was quietly restructured under Linder's supervision, and Lauren withdrew from several consulting engagements as the investigation remained active. Consequences unfolded not with chaos, but with steady limitation. Margaret continued overseeing her foundation, approving grants for technology education initiatives in neighborhoods where opportunity often arrived late, ensuring that resources once targeted for manipulation were redirected toward constructive growth. She expanded the independent oversight of her trusts even further, adding annual third-party audits and transparent reporting standards, not out of fear, but from an understanding that protection is most effective when embedded deeply. On a clear January afternoon, she met Daniel in a supervised mediation session arranged through counsel. The room was neutral, the conversation restrained. Daniel spoke about pressure, about fear of failure, about believing that securing control would prevent collapse. Margaret listened, acknowledging the weight of debt, but not excusing deception. She told him that trust is not inherited. It is demonstrated repeatedly through action, and that rebuilding it would require time measured not in weeks, but in years. There were no raised voices, only an acceptance that certain boundaries would remain firm. As spring approached, and ice along the shoreline broke into fragments drifting south, Margaret resumed her morning walks with renewed steadiness, the skyline reflecting brighter light across the water. She had not needed confrontation to assert strength. She had needed preparation. The architecture of her life, reinforced quietly and methodically, had withstood a deliberate attempt to undermine it. Standing by her windows one evening as the city glowed beneath a violet sky, Margaret understood that age had not diminished her authority. It had refined her discernment. Independence was no longer something she defended loudly. It was something she maintained deliberately, and in that deliberate steadiness lay a power no document could transfer and no miscalculation could erase.